Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Never Not Working. Why the Always-On Culture is Bad for Business, and How to Fix It, by Melissa Clark. Narrated by Pedersen. Publisher's Note. This audiobook has bonus material. Please contact whomever you purchased this audiobook from to request the material. All figures and the appendix referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Introduction. The Age of Overwork. From a young age, Marina felt like she was wasting time if she wasn't actively doing something. By high school, she had learned how to fill all her hours, first with school, then with soccer or track after school, then homework until midnight. She also got a job at an ice cream shop, and later a pizza place. To build her academic resume, she added student council, class vice president, school board student representative, and vice president of the Key Club. She topped it off with volunteering at Big Brothers Big Sisters. College demanded more studying and fewer sports, but Marina also worked 30 hours per week on top of her full class load. When summer came, she took a job selling books door to door, working 80-hour weeks and receiving awards for her time put in. This success led to an intense sales job that consumed her until she decided she also wanted to get a PhD. In academia, Marina managed to repeat the pattern, putting in extreme hours and participating in as many committees and programs as she could until she reached the top and received her doctorate and a professorship. All along, Marina knew she was overworking, but didn't seem to know how to stop. If she was being honest, she didn't want to stop. She lived off the adrenaline and always felt dread when she thought about not having enough to do. Marina was a workaholic. I know this because I have made it my life's work to study overwork and its effects on people and organizations. I have dedicated myself to learning why and how our culture has evolved to encourage overwork, and why it's becoming a bigger, more pervasive problem than ever. This book is dedicated to that exploration and to sharing the ways we can fight back against workaholism. I also know this because I am Marina. The biographical details I just shared are mine, Melissa's. I'm not that person anymore. I've worked hard to control my workaholic tendencies, and now I want to share what I've learned to overcome it. Why now? Why am I writing this book now? The truth is, it's long overdue. I've known what the data says for some time. I've experienced the effects of being an overworker, and I've spoken with and worked with so many others who've also experienced them. I could have written this book a couple of years ago, but there was that global pandemic. Also, I'm not sure if the world was ready to hear the message about the devastating effects of workaholism on ourselves and others back then. I'm hopeful that now is finally a time when people might be open to really hearing the facts and data about overwork and why it needs to be addressed, stat. You may have related to my story. It's not surprising, given that this sort of hustle culture has been ingrained in us from a young age and is ingraining itself deeply in the emerging generation that has never known a world without constant connection and on-demand service, two hallmarks of hustle culture. We learn from our first years that if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything you want. The implicit message there is that if you did not meet your childhood goals, then maybe you didn't work hard enough or put enough effort toward them. As adults, we have adopted busy as a status symbol, lest someone think we are not devoted to our work. Think about the question you hear daily. How are you? What's the common answer? Relaxed and not thinking about work, actually. Or crazy busy. Technology tethers us to our work through smartphones and productivity apps such as Slack and Teams, and the majority of workers regularly check their email on their smartphones, which never leave our side, even after work hours or on vacation. The rise in remote work means work and family spheres are no longer separate, blurring the boundaries between work and home. Or, as Andrew Barnes, entrepreneur and co-founder of 4-Day Week Global, put it to me, "We're not working from home, we're sleeping in the office." This is our new world of work. I'm not saying that hard work is bad, or that all hard work is workaholism. I'm saying that we need this book now because our relationship with work is becoming increasingly unhealthy. Levels of burnout and stress are at all-time highs. Even before the pandemic, the World Health Organization called stress the health epidemic of the 21st century. What is a major source of that stress? Our jobs. COVID-19 exacerbated this problem. During the pandemic, workdays became longer. In the United States, the average workday is now 3 hours longer. And in the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Spain, it's 2 hours longer. But more than that, we have gotten used to working outside traditional work hours. Microsoft has conducted several studies analyzing keystroke data and use of its collaboration software Teams chat feature. Results reveal 2 disturbing trends. Compared with pre-pandemic, during COVID, 1, we were much more likely to work in the evenings, typically in the hours before bedtime, in what has been dubbed the triple peak day, and 2, the number of work messages sent and received on the weekends increased by 200%. Now, 3 years later, the patterns that emerged in a crisis have been normalized. We have gotten used to them in just the same way people may develop a bad habit. What's even worse is that this increased workload, connectivity to work, and altered communication patterns have been tacked on to our existing schedules, meaning we are working longer and staying more tethered to work than ever before. This is happening everywhere, too. It's not just an American problem. Workaholism has been shown to be a problem all around the world. What is uniquely American is the fact that the United States is the only industrialized nation to offer 0 days of paid maternity/paternity leave, and the only country in the OECD to offer 0 days of paid leave at the federal level. Even in Japan, also known for its workaholic culture, the federal government mandates that workers get a minimum of 10 paid days of annual leave. In other words, workaholism in the United States is not entirely a cultural phenomenon. It's structurally reinforced and encouraged. In other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, there are encouraging signs that overwork is given the consideration it deserves. For example, in 2017, the French government implemented a right to disconnect law, which is a legal requirement for employers with 50-plus employees to set out hours when staff are not required to send or answer emails. Since then, other European countries, including Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Ireland, have implemented similar laws. And then there's Iceland, which recently participated in a 4-day week trial with resounding success. Workers went from a 40-hour schedule to a 35 or 36-hour schedule. Employees were happier, and organizations reported no loss in productivity. Some even reported increased productivity. Movements such as 4-Day Week Global continue to build momentum across the world, and the data is overwhelmingly positive. Companies are taking employee mental health more seriously than ever before. New technologies such as AI will further improve our efficiency and productivity, allowing us to accomplish tasks in less time. Leaders and organizations have a plethora of high-quality tools and resources at their fingertips to assess and improve worker well-being in their organizations. We do not need to work ourselves literally to death. There is another way. And we have to choose that other way. That's why I'm writing this book now, to help you make that choice. To show you that yes, you can choose balance over work obsession, and to give you some practical approaches for doing that. A broader approach. When I set out to understand overwork, I was surprised to learn just how much academic research already existed on the topic. At the same time, it was of varying quality, and much of it was not being communicated to anyone outside of academia. It was as if researchers had discovered a new infection, but hadn't thought to mention their discovery to the infected. Why, I thought, are we not applying these findings to a public that is so clearly overworked and burning out? We knew in academia that overwork was happening. We knew that it carried massive costs to people and to organizations and communities. Yet little was being done. I wanted to change that. What's more, I found that the books published on the topic were almost exclusively devoted to individuals and focused on individual strategies for combating workaholism. Self-help, if you will. I wanted to take a broader approach, because my research was uncovering a systemic problem driven not just by people like me with workaholic tendencies, but by the norms and expectations and, yes, even rules set by organizations and by society itself. This felt like an important piece of the puzzle that was missing. Just as we can't solve employee burnout by focusing only on self-care, we can't address the negative effects of workaholism without first addressing the place's demanding and always available work-first talent pool. This book is that broader approach. In addition to helping individuals recognize the signs of workaholism in themselves and others, it highlights several places you could look to understand potential leverage points for organizational change, regardless of whether you identify as a workaholic. What are the red flags for spotting whether an employee or supervisor is a workaholic? What are companies doing wrong? What are they doing right? Is your organization promoting well-being initiatives, often with the best of intentions, but simultaneously sending mixed signals to employees about what is valued and rewarded? Perhaps most important to organizations, I arm you with hard data about the costs of workaholism to both individuals and companies. So often in my work, I meet resistance to this message that work above all is deeply inefficient and costly. Some people point to individuals as the problem, just as we used to blame individuals solely for problems like alcoholism until we evolved to understand all the forces at play. Others suggest that what I'm researching is interesting but not applicable to them. They see only positive results from their hard-charging culture. But I know from the research and the data that those results don't last and come at a cost. A real human cost. I hope this book is a lever for people who want to change their culture with the means to convince other, more skeptical people they work with that they need to make this change. How this book works. I'll proceed simply, first by looking at the individual, then the organization. In Chapter 1, Workaholism, Myths and Realities, I'll set a working definition of the affliction and push back on some common misconceptions about workaholism that limit our full understanding of how insidious it can be. I challenge the notion that workaholism is not really that big a deal and is mostly a problem isolated to a few industries or occupations. I also challenge the notion that workaholism is a good thing, that workaholics are the best workers, and that there are some good types of workaholics. In Chapter 2, A Portrait of the Modern Workaholic, you'll learn about many of the characteristics of overworkers, including extreme examples. I dig a little deeper into the science behind why workaholism is so detrimental. Crucially, this portrait also includes how this affliction affects the people around the workaholic, and I share personal stories of loved ones of workaholics. Finally, I spend more time talking about and debunking the idea that workaholism is related to better performance. Chapter 3, Kicking the Habit, provides you with methods for raising awareness of workaholic tendencies in yourself or others, and 6 strategies for counteracting those tendencies, Anyone who has found themselves ruminating about work at unwanted times or feeling deep guilt for not working will want to start implementing some of these practical strategies right away. Chapter 4, Are You an Enabler?, pivots toward the organizational drivers of always-on workaholic cultures. I talk about the deeply rooted cultural drivers of workaholism and the organizational signals, policies, and practices that perpetuate it. Anyone who manages other people or who is trying to understand the complex intermixing of personal and organizational factors driving workaholism will find surprising and valuable insights here. Finally, in Chapter 5, Fixing Your Culture of Overwork, I provide actionable steps that you can take in your organization to assess, plan, and execute changes that will, over time and with effort, break down your workaholic cultural enablers. All of this is buffered by research, both qualitative and quantitative. As an academic, I began searching for answers to the questions brought on by overwork by diving into the scholarly research and conducting my own research. But I didn't stop there. I also reviewed the popular press books on the subject, and with my invaluable research team, interviewed close to 100 individuals who either struggle with workaholism, are partner to a workaholic, study the topic, or manage organizations and are dedicated to finding a better balance between work and life. Throughout this book, you will hear their stories, first-hand experiences of the impacts of workaholism and overwork culture, and you will hear from those who've escaped the clutches of their own obsession with work. You will hear from individuals in all ranks of organizations, working all kinds of jobs from a variety of cultures. You may see yourself reflected in some of these stories, or they may remind you of someone you know. I am grateful for the time each of them took to share their stories and to Workaholics Anonymous for their assistance reaching out to their members. The stories I heard were often heart-wrenching, and sometimes I felt that the problem was simply too big, too insidious, and too pervasive for me to make a difference. I wondered if change was possible. However, I also heard enough inspiring stories of recovery and change that I felt hope and was reminded why this book is necessary. In some cases, I've used pseudonyms and replaced personal details to protect the individuals who so graciously helped me. My goal with this book is to translate what we have learned through decades of research about workaholism and overwork culture to the people who have the ability and capacity to make actionable changes to benefit workers and themselves. So often, those in a position to make change discover they are workaholics themselves, unknowingly modeling the very behavior that leads to so many problems in the workforce. Change will be hard, and there is no simple one-size-fits-all approach, but you can do it. You will hear from both individuals and organizations that have made substantive changes to their culture and seen productivity gains, not losses, and higher engagement, not lower. If you are listening to this book, this suggests to me that you and your organization are willing to change and face these tough questions. This is the first step. Congratulations. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Workaholism, Myths and Realities. Let's start with some data. On average, people work fewer hours than ever. In countries with higher GDP, hours worked have declined the most. Also, in those countries, people on average earn more money than ever, and therefore require fewer hours to live comfortably. According to the late sociologist John Robinson, also known as Father Time for his extensive research on time use, most people have around 40 hours of free time per week. That's about a quarter of all time in the week, and assuming 8 hours of sleep, free time is 36% of waking hours. Recently, companies around the world have implemented a 4-day work week with positive results. Productivity gains were matched by employee satisfaction gains. So why am I writing a book about workaholism? From these statistics, it might seem that it's becoming less of a problem, not more. Well, let's add some more data. Workaholism is on the rise around the world. Today, almost half of U.S. workers would classify themselves as workaholics. According to a 2019 Forbes survey, that percentage is even higher for millennials, 66%. In addition, 70% of the millennials in the survey admitted to working most weekends, 2/3 admitted to working even when they were sick, and 1/3 admitted to working while sitting on the toilet. In 2018, 55% of Americans failed to use all of their paid time off, leaving 768 million vacation days on the table. This work fixation is expensive. Costs associated with the inevitable burnout and related health problems that accompany overwork are increased risk of metabolic syndrome, elevated blood pressure, greater susceptibility to autoimmune illnesses, poor sleep, poor physical and mental health, increased job stress and work-family conflict, and decreased job and family satisfaction. Before we square these seemingly contradictory paragraphs, it's important to remember that these are averages. The distribution of these trends is anything but even. Some people are working more and making less, and the systemic issues that have led to their being left out of the broader trend of higher pay and more free time must be addressed. For some, overwork isn't an affliction. It's a necessity to make ends meet, and that problem cannot be ignored, though it's not my primary focus. At the same time, it seems strange that on average people work less and make more, yet at the same time are more likely to identify as workaholics. If you were an HR leader, you could dismiss this as so much empty complaining by some workers. It may be tempting to throw up your hands and ask, "What else do you want?" And you may think there's no real return on assessing and mitigating workaholism in your organization. That would be a mistake. For just as workaholism is problematic for the workers, it's expensive to organizations too. Costs include higher turnover and absenteeism, rising healthcare costs given the negative physical and mental toll on workers, and decreased business growth, as well as the less quantifiable outcomes that arise when the workforce is unengaged, unhappy, exhausted, and burned out. The fundamental disconnect here is that most of us, workers or leaders or HR departments, have an erroneous sense of what workaholism is. Usually, we think it's directly correlated with how much we work. We tally hours and decide that too many hours on the job, 60 a week, 80, 100, turn one into a workaholic. Nope. It turns out that work hours are not a strong predictor of workaholism. They don't tell the full story, and they certainly don't help you identify and mitigate the problem, which you need to do. That's why those two paragraphs of data can coexist. Workaholism is about so much more than just a quantity of hours at work. Sure, work hours may an obvious sign of workaholism, but it's more than that. Workaholism also involves that feeling in the pit of your stomach that you can't rest, that you ought to be working all the time. Workaholism also involves feeling guilty and anxious when you are not working. It's the fact that even if you are not physically doing work, you are thinking about that email you should send, mulling over that upcoming work project, or ruminating about something that happened at work that day. It's living with the fear of losing something, status, money, the job itself, if you're not working. Whether you're the one suffering or you're someone who's managing a group of workaholics, this problem needs to be addressed because, having researched this phenomenon for more than 15 years, I can tell you that the effects of workaholism are worse than you think, both physically and socially, for people, teams, and organizations. Even if you do not identify as a workaholic, you are negatively affected by the workaholics around you, whether it is your spouse, boss, coworkers, or friends. Perhaps you are shouldering more than your fair share of domestic responsibilities because your partner is a workaholic. Or you have a boss who constantly texts and expects a response after hours no matter the time of day. Maybe you have a coworker who sets unrealistic standards for your team based on their idea, not yours, of how connected to work you should be. It could be that your best friend has drifted from you because they only ever want to talk about work when you get together, and they get irritated or disconnected talking about anything else. There are children who suffer due to a parent's fixation on their work, and their insistence that the fixation is the very thing providing the child with opportunities in life. These are only some of the real problems I've observed in my research. The entire scope of the negative effect of obsession with work are far-reaching and, in a few cases, even deadly. It's so common that some languages even have a word for it. In Japan, the word is karoshi, which translates roughly to death from overwork. In China, the term is gualasu. Estimates for rates of gualasu in China are staggering, with some reports placing it as high as over 1 million workers each year. In Chapter 3, I'll go into more detail about personal stories of how workaholism affects people's lives, not just the workaholics, but of those around them. But for now, it's important to know 2 things about the effects of workaholism. 1, it leads to serious negative physical and mental effects. And 2, people usually believe they themselves are immune to those effects, even if others aren't, and that they can manage them, even if others can't. But they are fooling themselves. The science doesn't lie. We know that workaholics are at greater risk of negative health events, including cardiovascular disease, sleep problems, and elevated blood pressure. I've spoken with individuals who have experienced more than 1 heart attack while working. Typically, just 1 heart attack is not enough to get workaholics to try to change, believe it or not. Every single workaholic I interviewed for this book has faced a health issue that is directly or indirectly tied to their overwork. Workaholics are also much more likely than the average worker to experience severe burnout, which involves overwhelming exhaustion, feelings of cynicism and detachment from the job, and a sense of lack of accomplishment. I've found that workaholics are particularly likely to experience the exhaustion component. It's not hard to draw a line from these effects to poor effects for the organization. We may work less, yes, but the problem is not the hours on the job. It's that our relationship to work and its meaning to us is becoming increasingly unhealthy. If we're going to fix it, we need to understand clearly what we are and are not dealing with here. Myth: workaholics are the ideal workers. Throughout this chapter, I'll bust common workaholism myths. Here is the first one: the myth of the ideal worker. Someone who wholly devotes themselves to work above all else, and who persists despite plenty of evidence that the ideal worker doesn't exist and isn't a good model. The workaholic strives to embody the ideal worker prototype, perfectly efficient human capital to be deployed and used to its fullest extent. But for all the reasons outlined in this chapter, and more that will come throughout the rest of this book, it doesn't work. It will backfire every time. Workaholism is not. To know what workaholism is, beyond some arbitrary number of hours worked, first we need to understand what it is not. It's not a clinical condition. It's easy to see that the term workaholism, which I know isn't great, derives from the common trope of adding aholic to a noun to describe any sort of obsession, from mild, like chocolate or shopping, to true compulsions. Obviously, the ism of workaholism makes the noun become about the condition rather than the person. It's a bit more awkward sounding, but it's become the term of art, and it's what we'll most commonly use to describe the problem. It was not coined in the same vein as, say, chocoholic.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?